With the candidate assassinated, Ecuador prepares for elections. Fernando Villavicencio was shot and killed at a campaign rally last week. He promised to expose corruption and break the powerful grip of gangs and narco-traffickers. But did it cost him his life? Or is more at play behind his death? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Ecuador. Ecuador is reeling after Fernando Villavicencio, known for speaking out against drug cartels and corruption, was killed in Quito last week. He was on the campaign trail just 10 days ahead of a national election when multiple shots were fired, killing Villavicencio and injuring 9 others. Police say his killers also left behind an undetonated grenade. The shocking event has tragically highlighted Ecuador's ever-deteriorating security. Villavicencio was a former trade unionist and journalist and had a record of exposing corruption. He had just submitted a report to the Attorney General's office about corruption in the oil industry, though no further details have been released about that. He was an outspoken critic of former President Rafael Correa and was sentenced to 18 months in prison for defamation over statements he made against the former leader. But he fled to indigenous territory within Ecuador and later was given asylum in Peru. At his last rally, Villavicencio spoke out against the increased security risks in the country.
On August 20, comrades, a choice will be made between the mafia and the homeland. Either the gangsters triumph and return, or the good people, the Democrats, the brave people win the battle and get the homeland back. Here, nothing is free. Here, things cost us our lives. This democracy has cost us our lives. Defending our homeland has cost us our lives, and we will not allow a new betrayal.
Well, 3 days of national mourning and a state of emergency followed his death, while people also took to the streets demanding an end to rising violence in the country. A combination of weak economic growth, volatile politics, and the growing reach of cocaine trafficking gangs has led to severe destabilization. Outgoing President Guillermo Lazo's government has blamed rising violence on the streets and in prisons on criminal infighting to control trafficking routes used by Mexican cartels, the Albanian mafia, and others to move drugs. Thousands of Ecuadorian soldiers and police were involved this weekend in an operation to move 3 notorious gang leaders to a maximum security prison. It's believed José Adolfo Macías, known as Fito, sent death threats to Villavicencio before his assassination. Now, during the move, police raided Guayaquil's prison number 4, seizing marijuana, cocaine, ammunition, fireworks, and mobile phones, among other items. Despite the violence and assassination, the government has vowed that the vote will still be held this weekend, even if under increased military protection.
La patria enfrenta una batalla decisiva.
The homeland faces a decisive battle to protect democracy, security, and peace in the face of the brutal threats of transnational crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism.
Well, Villavicencio's Movimiento Construye or Build Party has chosen another replacement candidate, reversing its choice from a day earlier. Build Party now says Christian Zurita will run on their behalf. While Zurita's candidacy is being processed, electioneering continues. At a political debate held Sunday night, an empty podium stood in Villavicencio's place. Several candidates promised to tackle crime during the debate.
The
inheritance left to us by past government is a national tragedy in terms of economic policy, indebtedness, corruption, and this fiscal deficit. This is the fault of the past, but it does not matter. We are going to fight them first by guaranteeing citizen security, recovering institutionally. But besides that, we have resources from where they can be obtained to give economic growth and lower poverty indexes.
I start this debate within the worst insecurity crisis in our history. More blood has been shed so far this year. Agustin, Fernando, 4,570 Ecuadorians, than in all the conflicts of our republic. Ecuador is subdued by fear and hopelessness. That is why I count on you to implement the zero-tolerance plans, retake control of 36 prisons in the country in our northern and southern borders, so that never again drug trafficking or illicit weapons enter our streets.
So is Ecuador today what its neighbor Colombia was in the 80s and 90s? And can it ever return to the peaceful, stable nation it had been before? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are, from the Ecuadorian capital, writer Matthew Carpenter-Arevalo. From Quito, writer, essayist, and sociologist Inkarri Kowii. And from Managua, Nicaragua, is journalist and editor-in-chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report, Ben Norton. Thanks all so much for being with me. Matthew, I'll start with you. You know, Ecuador was always pretty remarkable because it was sandwiched between two highly unstable states for so long, one being Peru, that was battling shining path rebels for many years, the other Colombia, which many considered a narco state that was also in a state of civil war. But Colombia cracked down on narco traffickers and on rebel groups. It changed its image, it boosted tourism, while Ecuador seemed to pick up the crime and the insecurity that its neighbor was eliminating. So should Ecuador's leaders have seen that coming and maybe done more to prevent it, or was all of this kind of inevitable?
Well, a number of things have happened over the last couple of years that have changed the context from what Colombia lived in the 1980s. First of all, the power in the drug war shifted from the producers to the distributors. And so whereas Colombia was able to consolidate behind the smaller cartels, in Mexico, you have numerous groups that are doing battle, and they're the ones that are largely financing the different groups in Ecuador that are currently fighting over trafficking routes. And then the second question is, was this not present in Ecuador in the past years, or was it operating just with the auspices of official complicity? Was there basically government permission for these groups to operate in the country as long as they kept violence low and as long as they stayed out of the news? Now that there are different groups that are fighting for control of territory, we are much more aware of their presence in the country, but it's likely that they've been operating here for a long time. It's just now come to international attention, and it's wreaking havoc on the civilian population.
Is Ecuador possibly also a victim of its own kind of geographical location?
Absolutely, because Colombia and Peru have had amongst their largest crop productions in the last couple of years of cocaine, so much so that the price of cocaine on the streets has dropped significantly, which causes all kinds of other problems. And so this problem continues to exist in Colombia and Peru. The difference is that they're not operated with the same level of violence that we have had in Quito recently, because those markets are far more consolidated in terms of who is moving the drugs through them, and therefore there's less need for violence.
Okay. Inkarri, if you can, give us some kind of personal perspective on how you've felt the country change, both socially and, of course, in respect to security.
Yes, I think the fear is one of the emotions that is ruling right now between society. We don't have we are kind of quiet. We don't know how to react to the violence. We don't know how to be and live in a peaceful society anymore. So we don't have a hope for find a solution. There is a sense of pessimism in everyone. We don't know what is going to happen in the next few days. The election days are going to be a stressful day, and I think we're just living day by day. We don't know. We can plan for a long-term plans, and that's not only for the government but for the individuals and the society in general. I think fear is the sense, the emotion that is ruling right now in our country.
Yeah, which is so tragic, because fear, I used to attend university in Ecuador, and it always was so remarkable to me that the the country was as peaceful as it was, that the people were so calm, and there was never a sense of fear. For as corrupt as the politicians could be, Ecuador was this real anomaly in the South American context. It doesn't feel that way anymore, very sadly. Let's talk more than about the election. Ben, let me come to you. You know, we keep kind of repeating that Villavicencio spoke out against the drug cartels and corruption. But to be fair, most candidates do. You know, most platforms will say, I'm going to cut down on corruption. I'm going to make, you know, this a fairer, more just society. Was he actually cleaner? I mean, has Ecuador lost a candidate that could have helped the country?
Well, it's really hard to speculate, and there has been a lot of speculation on social media. There have been videos of people allegedly in a drug cartel taking credit, although that video was later shown to be false. So it's very difficult to say with certainty. But I think what we can say with certainty is that one of the key culprits for this is the current president, Guillermo Lasso. And for people who don't follow Ecuadorian politics, it's really important to stress that essentially the presidency is closely linked to the very same kinds of corruption and organized crime that we're talking about today. In fact, the current president, Guillermo Lasso, who is a very wealthy banker, he has been notorious for many years for being linked to corruption. His name has basically been synonymous with offshore bank accounts. His name appeared in the Pandora Papers. He's been linked to tens of millions of dollars in properties in Florida and many other countries. And in fact, he dissolved the democratically elected National Assembly in order to prevent this parliamentary body for launching an impeachment proceeding against him for corruption, for being linked, for instance, to the Albanian mafia. So the reality is that under Guillermo Lasso, Ecuador has gone from a very safe country to one of the most dangerous countries in Latin America. And in fact, when President Correa left, who governed from 2007 until 2017, Correa, through a variety of measures, including increasing social funding and community policing, he dropped the murder rate from 16 per 10,000 Ecuadorians to 6. And since then, it has increased from 6 to 26, the highest level in modern Ecuadorian history. Guillermo Lasso bears the majority of the responsibility for that. And yet, what we're instead seeing is this attempt to try to blame other candidates on all of these things, and not the discussion that, in reality, what we see is a failed state. Guillermo Lasso has cut social spending for everything. He's closely been linked to corruption, just funneling money out of the country, massive capital flight, inequality has increased. And that explains why he is the least popular president in Latin America with a 13% approval rating.
Interesting. Matthew, let me ask if you agree. And also, why do you think Villavicencio was actually targeted here? And we have to remember, according to the polls, he wasn't even expected to make it to the second round. What was going on?
Right. Well, I think what Ben said is a vast oversimplification. I think one of the first things that we have to remember that Rafael Correa did when he was elected president in 2007 was to shut down the U.S. military base that was used to monitor the Pacific Ocean for drug trafficking. So I myself am no defender of Guillermo Lasso, but Rafael Correa did threaten Fernando Villavicencio's life on numerous occasions. These are public, these are tweets. And he also said that if his party comes back to power, his vengeful will be swift and personal. So I'm not speculating on who may be responsible for Fernando Villavicencio's death, but it doesn't look good when politicians from the past that have, for example, been very public about stating their opposition to the extradition of drug criminals to the United States to face prosecution for drug trafficking, are also deeply involved in this. And part of the thing that we have to understand is that drug trafficking and corruption are deeply intertwined. One of the ways in which drug traffickers like to launder their money in order to be able to cede inheritances to their family members and to friends and others is through government contracts. And so we've seen a number of cases where other authorities, not as high level as Fernando Villavicencio, have been killed number of weeks ago, the mayor of Manta, which is Ecuador's fourth largest city, was assassinated while out doing his job. And so we know that the drug trafficking and the corruption are deeply intertwined, and Rafael Correa's government left behind it a history of corruption, especially in the oil sector, which is what caused Fernando Villavicencio to have to seek refuge in the Amazon and stay there for a period of time in order to avoid official persecution. So if we think of this as being the responsibility of one or two politicians, we're entirely missing the point. We're playing a partisan game that doesn't really serve the country, because the analysis requires a much deeper understanding of the actors and what's at stake.
Okay. Inkarri, do you actually think they will find the culprit, the people who did this, soon, or will those potentially guilty be protected?
We have to look how the international press are reacting. Here in Ecuador, we are saying that in Colombian or European news are publishing and giving more importance to the Villavicencio's death than the newspapers here or media here in Ecuador. So we also know that the state, the justice in our country doesn't work fast enough, well enough. So I'm afraid that as other cases that Matthew has already speak of, we are not going to find, or we are not going to have fast news about the responsibles of this death. I think we are in a political season. The elections are coming very fast, very soon, in this Sunday. So the news or the truth about this case probably is going to be displayed for the next weeks.
Okay.
I don't think we expect we have all the truth.
Yeah. Ben, let me ask you this. I mean, because 6 Colombians, as we know, have been arrested. They'll be accused of this crime or connection to it. But in the meantime, they've gone and arrested, they've transferred prisoners in these Ecuadorian prisons. It's so remarkable that Ecuadorian prisons have fallen so far beyond the control of law. We saw almost 4,000 soldiers and police officers participate in the relocation of, Fito. How is that possible? What is the collaboration between, the prisons and the government to allow the gangs and narco-traffickers to control those as well?
This is the key question, and this is why it is not an oversimplification to talk about the damage that Guillermo Lasso and also the previous president, Lenin Moreno, have done to Ecuador. I mean, it's not partisan to point out the objective fact reported by World Bank data that the murder rate in Ecuador decreased by more than half from 16 to 6 under Correa, and has skyrocketed from 6 to 26 under Lenin Moreno, and especially under Lasso. And it's precisely because they've abandoned the policies of social investment, of support for poor and working Ecuadorians. Inequality has been rapidly rising. Poverty has been rapidly rising in Ecuador in recent years. And we're seeing essentially a social collapse, a major social crisis. These are the issues that in the presidential campaign are being discussed, not only violence, the increasing precariousness for many Ecuadorian workers, which of course, when people are in poverty and desperate, it leads to the rise of violence and crime. And in the case of the prisons, one of the hallmarks of the Lasso administration has been massacres, dozens of massacres in prisons all across Ecuador. And once again, it's because we're seeing such a weakening of the state through defunding, through corruption, through privatization, that what we have seen is that essentially gangs have taken over the prisons. And that's why they need so many resources in order to move some of these prisoners, because essentially the state can no longer control out of these prisons. This is what happens when you engage in the massive weakening of the state that we've seen under the millionaire banker Lasso. Whereas, again, it's not partisan to point out that Ecuador became the second safest country in Latin America under Correa, and it is now one of the most dangerous.
Okay, Matthew?
Again, the factors at play have a lot to do with this. When Colombia signed its peace agreement, you basically took a consolidated player that was responsible for moving 90% of the cocaine from South America to North America, and you broke that up into smaller groups that are now fighting for control over different routes. And as a result of that, we're living in an entirely different circumstance. Rafael Correa and his government took Ecuador's debt to historic highs and left the country completely bankrupt. And as a result, there has been a retreat of the state that started under Lenin Moreno, who we have to remember was Rafael Correa's candidate. And then Guillermo Lasso was elected president because he wasn't the candidate representing Rafael Correa. Nobody really liked Guillermo Lasso. He was a very unpopular figure. Yet he was elected because people were tired of Rafael Correa and his influence. So again, I do think that the partisan nature is highly oversimplific because corruption is not a bug in the system. Corruption is the system. And so regardless of what actors we have had running the country, corruption continues. And so until we manage corruption and until the United States changes its policies around legal narcotics, these issues are likely to continue.
Okay, we're down to our last few minutes. Let me come back to the election, though. Inkarri, let me ask you this. As for the election, I mean, does this assassination actually boost the profile now of Christian Zurita, who's stepping in for Villavicencio? Or has it made the party look maybe too chaotic? You know, first by choosing his running mate, then changing their minds a day later, and then choosing Christian Zurita. Where does that leave the party?
Just before I respond, I want to say that poverty indicators, unemployment indicators, and social investment indicators started to decline in the last years of Korea's government. That is not true that only Lenin Moreno and Lasso retired this fundament and the bad performance of the government and the state in Ecuador, economy in Ecuador, is just the responsibility of the last two presidents. It started at the last years of Korea because we didn't have anymore the money of oil money that was incoming to our funds, and of course corruption. The amount of corruption that cost us. It had cost for the other governments to take decisions where to cut this funding. For your questions, I have to say that we have last night, Sunday night, the presidential debate, and well, it was a little confused, but I think it boosted the profile of John Topic with his security discourse. And a surprise for me was Daniel Noboa, a young entrepreneur that have positioned well in the public opinion. I think Christian Zurita didn't have the chance to participate, and that's a punch for the weak democracy and weak institutions we have, because once again, we're indoors of the elections, the institution whose responsibility to organize the elections are being questioned again, and that we don't have the confidence in this institution, and democracy is based in confidence.
Okay, let me ask Ben one final question. I mean, should this vote be postponed? Some have actually called for that, or need it go forward because maybe Ecuador has actually hit a low point and it can actually get better from here?
Well, that's for the Ecuadorian people to decide, but it has definitely reached a low point, and people are demanding an election and a new leader, because I want to remind viewers here that the current president, Guillermo Lasso, is governing essentially as a dictator. He has no democratic oversight over him. He dissolved the National Assembly. There needs to be an election. And again, the reality is that we've seen this social collapse under his policy. So further extending his mandate is only going to, I think, make the situation even worse. The reality is that, yes, it was not perfect, but the standard of living of average Ecuadorian workers drastically increased under Correa. And since his traitorous vice president, Lenin Moreno, who formed an alliance with Guillermo Lasso, came to power, the country has gone from the second safest in Latin America to one of the most dangerous, poverty has been drastically increasing, inequality and corruption. It's never going to be perfect. No society is perfect. But that explains why the candidate from the Citizens Revolution Party, the Citizens Revolution movement that was created by Correa, that explains why she is leading in all of the polls, González. She's very likely going to win in the first round and potentially the second round. So you need to talk about that fact that, again, it's not partisan to point out that the most popular political movement in the country is the Correísta movement, because people recognize that their standards of living did increase during the Citizens Revolution from 2007 until 2017, and they want to bring that back. And we'll see what happens at the polls. But we'll see what happens in the election. But all of the polls show that the Citizens Revolution will likely win.
Okay, Matthew, I can imagine you
so
disagree,
just on
but
that last
unfortunately
point,
we only have 10 seconds left. I know, I'm going to have to leave it there.
So it's actually a constitutional mechanism that allows him to dissolve Congress and call new elections, and his power is checked by the Constitutional Court. So it's simply not true to call him a dictator. It's entirely within the Constitution.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I think we're going to return to this topic in a few weeks, maybe after the election, and we'll see where Ecuador stands then. But for now, we'll have to leave it there, and I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.